This is the second part of our series on guns in Nigeria. In part 1, we focused on the AK-47 and President Buhari's recent directive that the military should shoot anyone on site who is caught carrying an AK-47 illegally. In part 2, Nabilah, Alex, and our guests are going to discuss the laws and practices that regulate, and in some cases enable, the local and global flow of small arms and light weapons, like the AK-47. We begin with the rise of Boko Haram.
In 2003, the insurgent group that eventually became known as Boko Haram attacked police stations in Yobe, that's in northeast Nigeria. That attack is the first record of reported attacks that we could find. They killed policemen, stole weapons and vehicles. And for the next couple of years, that was how they operated. They attacked police stations and stole weapons. Much like what's happening now in the southeast. And back then, the government took action.
In 2005, the Nigerian military and police embarked on a security operation called Operation Sawdust. They arrested members of the sect who they believed to be a threat to the federal government. So at the time, the government was reacting to specific incidents and arresting specific individuals. But from what we could gather, there was no integrated national effort to control the flow of illicit firearms. And maybe part of the reason for that was government didn't really take Boko Haram seriously back then. Or at the very least, the government didn't imagine that Boko Haram would grow to be the menace that it is today. Remember, northern Nigeria had a few instances of fringe groups who identified with some extreme interpretations of Islam, or interpretations that are different from the standard Wahhabi one that is commonly practiced in the north. For example, there was the Maitasini uprising in the 1980s. Then there's the Shiite version practiced by El-Zakzaki and his followers. So maybe this group, that's the early version of Boko Haram, the ones attacking the police stations, were also seen in that same light as just extremists, as a small local fringe group that would eventually, fizzle out and be forgotten. In fact, in 2007, the federal government went ahead and released certain members who were held in detention when the new president, Yar'Adua, gave into lobbying from Muslim clerics and scholars.
But the problem is that the Boko Haram uprising was happening in a different time. This was a time of globalization, specially aided by the internet. Even though the group was local, their ideology and eventually their funding was global. So between 2004 and 2009, we basically saw them gaining followership. And they were also amassing arms. By 2009, intelligence reports about the group's increasing violence and militarization led to the intervention of the federal government.
Mohamed Youssef was the leader of an Islamic sect which launched deadly raids across northern Nigeria this week. He died in police custody just hours after security forces said they'd captured him in the city of Maiduguri. Police troops had stormed Boko Haram's stronghold on Wednesday night, killing many of the militants and forcing others.
In July of that same 2009, the government raided the group's hideout in Dusun Tanshi, an area in Bauchi State. Security forces had arrested 9 members of the group and seized materials for making bombs along with other weapons. This led to a clash with the group that lasted 3 days and spread across to 3 other states. At least 700 people were reported to have died. At that time, I assume one of the most concerning things for the Nigerian government was the question of where was Boko Haram getting its weapons from?
So to understand where Boko Haram may be getting its weapons from, we have to look at the firearms trade, both the local and global trade, and the laws that govern that trade.
Lagos Racecourse is the scene, and it's the afternoon of Nigeria's great day, with thousands awaiting the climax and resolved to relish every minute leading up to it. Princess Alexandra...
It was the year before independence, and Nigeria was preparing to govern her affairs for the first time. The future was promising. This was also the year Nigeria would pass its first set of laws around gun control, the Firearms Act of 1959.
If you happened to be 17 years old, had great eyesight, were of sound mind, temperate habits, and hadn't been convicted of a violent crime 5 years prior, then you could apply to own a firearm. Not just any firearm, though. As a civilian, you could apply for hunting rifles and personal firearms like shotguns, but the shotguns that are not automatic or semi-automatic. So basically, the AK-47s would not even be allowed back then. Commissioners would give you approval for the hunting rifles, while the Inspector General of Police would need to give you approval for the personal firearms. There was also a class of weapons termed Prohibited Firearms. These are the weapons that civilians could not own unless permission was granted by the president. These included grenades, machine guns, bombs, revolvers, basically military-grade weapons. The law also had penalties that ranged from imprisonment between 2 to 10 years, depending on the violation, and a fine of 1,000 naira. The 1959 law also had provisions for the sale and transfer of arms, which requires all arms dealers to be licensed. It made provisions for public armories, import and export, as well as the manufacturing and repair of arms. But the law did not make provisions for disarmament.
And the issue of disarmament would become relevant 11 years later. In 1967, Nigeria entered into a civil war. Lots of weapons flowed into the country, and by the end of the war in 1970, those weapons were still lingering around. After the war, the government started a demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration process, but based on what we could find, the disarmament and reintegration parts of the process, especially, were not properly implemented.
After that unfortunate incident, the government was supposed to run a program to encourage people to drop arms, to lay down arms. During the process of war, a lot of people acquired either legally or illegally arms to protect themselves. So the government was supposed to run a program to encourage the people to lay down arms. But unfortunately, we didn't have that. And that was the carryover that we had.
That was Olumayowa Olani, a security analyst. Now, because the government's disarmament process was insufficient, weapons that remained in the public space were then used for various illicit activities, primarily robbery, through the 1980s into the 1990s. By 2003, there was an estimated 1 million small arms in circulation. This is according to Small Arms Survey. And by 2012, that number had gone up to 7 million.
Hey, Nabilah, the 1 million in 2003, I understand that those could be the weapons remaining from the Civil War. And as you said, government didn't really do a sufficient enough job with disarmament. But if there was an increase from 1 million to 7 million, that means more weapons are somehow getting into circulation.
That's right. Part of the increase has to do with local craft production of small arms. After the Civil War, large numbers of Nigerians from the southeast were displaced. And remember, some of the engineers and craftsmen were involved in weapons manufacturing for Biafra during the war. After the war, some of these engineers and craftsmen were not properly reintegrated, so they converted their skills to civilian use. Now, the Firearms Act forbids the production or repair of firearms without a license.
Yeah, but who is monitoring?
Exactly. The activities were not monitored, and from 1970 to the onset of the 21st century, the local crafts industry in small arms grew, especially in Awka, Anambra State. There were other local manufacturing centers in the South-South, as well as in Kaduna and Katsina states, but the Southeast was by far the center for craft production of local weapons. So, as Boko Haram was coming up, they would have had access to the local pool of weapons, but it turns out that the local pool may not be Boko Haram's main source for weapons. According to a report by SB Morgan Intelligence published in April 2020, local manufacturing tends to fuel conflicts in the middle part of the country, not the northern parts. Conflicts in the northeast are more likely to be supported by access to a global pool of weapons.
After World War II, millions of weapons were destroyed, but hundreds of thousands continued to circulate around the world. More weapons became cheaper and easily produced, and weapons like the AK-47 also entered into circulation. They played a huge role in escalating small conflicts, and these weapons made their way from Vietnam to Afghanistan, Liberia, Congo to Rwanda, and eventually they drew closer and closer to home. They flowed to Chad during the civil war between 2005 to 2010, and to Libya from 2011 to now.
Before 2001, there was really nothing regulating the global flow of arms. According to SIPRI, that's the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the 5 largest arms exporters in the world are the United States, Russia, France, Germany, and China, accounting for over 75% of all exports in the world between 2016 and 2020. The 5 largest arms importers in the world are Saudi Arabia, India, Egypt, Australia, and China, which account for about 36% of global imports between 2016 and 2020. Now, keep in mind, these numbers represent the legal trade in arms, and Nigeria is not even in the list of top 40 importers, according to SIPRI. And that's probably because of what happened between 2001 and 2013.
In 2001, the United Nations held a conference on the illicit and illegal trade in small arms and light weapons. And it was to provide a global framework on addressing the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. A year before that conference, members of the African Union, the AU, met in Bamako, Mali. They met to establish a common African position on tackling the problem of illicit small arms and light weapons trade and proliferation. At this meeting, the African countries developed the Bamako Declaration. They saw that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons is a regional problem and would need multilateral regional cooperation. So they committed to strengthening already existing measures that aimed at small arms proliferation. But the AU also made an appeal to the international community, and particularly to the arms exporting countries, to limit their trade to only governments and authorized traders. This Bamako Declaration is the document that the AU then presented to the United Nations at the 2001 conference. Many countries that attended the 2001 conference, especially those in Africa, were hoping to get international support to help get rid of small arms from the continent.
But the US representative at that conference, John Bolton, made it clear that the US could not support certain aspects of the proposed program of action. Specifically, Bolton stated, and I quote, "We do not support measures that would constrain legal trade and legal manufacturing of small arms and light weapons. We do not support measures that prohibit civilian possession of small arms." And perhaps the most damning and disappointing statement he made, "We do not support measures limiting trade in small arms and light weapons solely to governments." Nevertheless, the UN did adopt a plan of action after the 2001 conference that included specific guidelines that countries could voluntarily implement.
Well, before the ATT, what was there was the United Nations Program of Action, what we call the UNPOA, which is not a legally binding instrument. It's a political instrument in which member states agreed in 2001 to take up measures to control the proliferation of small arms and light weapons around the world, because there was the recognition that these small arms and light weapons, again, have also been used to fuel conflict, the commitment of human rights abuses and crime. So there was the UNPOA before the ATT, but the UNPOA is not a treaty, it's a political instrument.
That was Machofi Singo. He works at the Security Research and Information Center in Nairobi, and he's also a member on the board of the Arms Trade Treaty Monitor. That's an organization that tracks the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty, that's the ATT, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the 2001 United Nations Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons called for countries to mark weapons and ammunitions that they would sell to enable tracing to the country and manufacturer of origin. But remember, our 1959 Firearms Act actually has provisions for marking and stamping of weapons, so that part is not really new for Nigerians. However, the Programme of Action calls for national focal points, as well as the reporting of weapons imported and exported by member states. The national focal point is to serve as a center for carrying out activities related to gun control. For example, this focal point will be responsible for running disarmament groups and programs, monitoring and auditing arms manufacturing, and public enlightenment programs.
Kenya has a national focal point on small arms and light weapons that is specially dedicated, that deals with all issues of small arms and light weapons in the country. Okay? And they not only work as a government agency, but they're also working actively with civil society organizations that are working on small arms and light weapons issues. And one of the things that they do, this commission in Kenya, is one, awareness creation. Yeah? They work with the communities and local peace committees in areas that have been hit by small arms and light weapons to create awareness about the dangers of illicit arms possession among civilians. They're also instrumental in implementing government policies on disarmament, community disarmament. They are also involved they are the ones that attend these meetings, the UN meetings in New York. I have attended 2 meetings with Kenyan
From what
officials.
we could gather, Nigeria is the only country in West Africa that currently does not have a national focal point. However, there is a bill currently in the House and the Senate to establish a national commission against the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. The bill has already passed the second reading in both houses and is currently waiting for a report from the Committee on National Intelligence. If signed into law, this would basically set up the national focal point.
But even Machofi admits that while several countries have established a national focal point and they are effective, it's unclear if they actually have an impact on lowering the number of illicit weapons circulating in a given country. We asked Machofi if Kenya has seen a reduction in small arms proliferation since implementing the national focal point.
I would say it's a difficult question to answer. There's a study that was commissioned by Small Arms Survey in 2012, and that study put the estimated number of illicit small arms in the country at that time at around 530 households with arms, and the estimated number to be about 700 or something, 1,000. Now, 700,000, yes. Now, I saw another estimate that was done 2 years ago that seemed to suggest that those numbers had increased. One of the reports was quoting that there are almost 900,000 towards 1 million. So you want to say that there may not be a marked increase in those numbers. Yeah?
Yeah.
There may not be a marked increase. But at the same time also, you cannot see evidence that those numbers have decreased.
So, based on this, the most effective way to reduce the number of illicit weapons coming from the global pool from circulating may be to stop them from coming in the first place. Because even if we manage to mark weapons and even if we periodically conduct disarmament programs and sensitization programs, if weapons keep flowing in, we're always going to be chasing this problem around and around. And to stop arms from coming in, we would need laws that prevent or restrict major exporters from importing arms to Nigeria.
And that's what finally happened in 2013.
The 71st plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order.
Mr. President, the United States is proud to have been able to co-sponsor and vote in favor of adopting the Arms Trade Treaty. The treaty is strong.
That year, the United Nations adopted the Arms Trade Treaty, the ATT, which would become international law on Christmas Eve on the 24th of December 2014. The ATT sets out global rules to control the flow of weapons, ammunitions, and related items to countries when it is known that they will be diverted or used to commit and facilitate crimes against humanity, war crimes, and serious human rights violations. The treaty introduced specific controls that govern both importers and exporters. One control is around risk assessment.
The ATT introduces and legalizes, if you will, the issue of reporting. Because reporting is important, because transparency is important. Number two is the question of diversion. Because studies have shown that some of the weapons that are being used in conflict situations, they are weapons that have been diverted, that a country is exporting to a certain other country, but those arms don't reach that country. They are diverted in between. And when they are diverted in between, they go to fund conflict. It has happened in South Sudan, for example. It is happening in Yemen and elsewhere.
Before a participating state can export arms, it must assess if there is an overriding risk that the arms they are selling will be diverted for anything other than the intended purposes that does not violate human rights. It puts the exporting countries on notice that they should be aware of selling to politically unstable countries. And in fact, we saw this particular treaty in action in 2014.
Now, 2014 happened to be the year Boko Haram birthed a splinter group and earned a notorious reputation for using improvised explosive devices, that's IEDs, using suicide bombers, and carrying out targeted and indiscriminate attacks alike. By the end of 2014, they had killed over 6,000 civilians since their first major battle with government forces in 2009. In April of 2014, the group carries out what is arguably their boldest move yet.
Hundreds of young girls, fast asleep in their beds, are awakened by the sound of gunfire. Armed attackers have stormed their boarding school and set fire to dozens of buildings. Nearly 300
They kidnapped 276 schoolgirls from Chibok local government area in Borno State. And that same year, they escalated the frequency and severity of their attacks. By July, Nigeria was estimated to have had the highest number of terrorist killings in the world in the year 2014 alone. Records from that year show that 3,477 people were killed in 146 attacks, mostly in the northeastern part of the country. Despite their best efforts, the Nigerian military found themselves fighting a war with an enemy that was somehow much better armed. As of this time, the only weapons manufacturer in Nigeria was the Defense Industries Corporation of Nigeria, that's DICON, and this is still the case. But DICON didn't have the capacity to supply the Nigerian army with what was needed. So, to match Boko Haram's firepower, President Goodluck Jonathan's government at the time had to purchase weapons. So President Jonathan turned to the United States of America for help again.
The Nigerian government had previously, on multiple occasions, requested for help in the form of weapons supply. These requests were repeatedly denied, and this time was no different. The Obama-led administration denied the president's requests. At that time, the United States had signed the ATT, and was even in the process of ratification. Now, we're not sure if the ATT was the reason why the US did not sell weapons to the Jonathan administration, but either way, the US denied his request. In a 2015 report published by Vanguard newspaper, it was revealed that President Jonathan wrote 25 letters to the US and other nation states, asking to buy state-of-the-art weapons to decisively deal with the terrorists. Each of those letters were met with the same response: no.
So, in this case, it does appear as if the ATT is functioning as designed. Our country has a history of human rights violations and maybe even weapons diversion. So if exporting countries do a risk assessment, it would make sense that they would limit sales to us.
So then how is Boko Haram getting their weapons? They have state-of-the-art weapons.
Right. The ATT might have stopped the Jonathan administration from acquiring arms through legal channels, but it doesn't entirely stop the illicit flow of arms. Diversion is a term used to describe the movement of arms from the legal to the illicit market or from authorized users to unauthorized users. Now, according to ATT Monitor, diversion can happen along 4 points in the transfer chain. First, at the country of origin. Second, while in transit to the destination. Third, at the destination port of delivery. And fourth, from the national stockpiles.
So let's look at diversion at the first part of that transfer chain, diversion at the country of origin. According to a 2020 report on arms trafficking by the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, they say that there is a little to no connection between licit or legal trade and illicit or illegal trade. So, for example, Nigeria receives small arms and light weapons primarily from European countries. According to the United Nations Register on Conventional Arms, Nigeria has received at least 33,000 small arms and light weapons between 2008 to 2019. Most are coming from Eastern European countries, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Poland, Serbia. These are the countries that engage in the legal trade, and they report what they export to us, Nigerians. But according to the UN's data on arms seized, the countries that would engage in illicit trade tend to be in North America. So it's possible that the illegal flow of arms to Boko Haram and other groups may be happening from a country's point of origin, maybe somewhere in North America.
But another report by the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, published in 2018, states that while diversion can take place from the country of origin or during transit, it actually often occurs shortly after delivery to the intended user of the weapons.
So basically, diversion is more likely to happen once the weapons reach Nigeria.
That's right. We spoke to Fiyade Olubenga, who works for the West African Network on Small Arms, WANSA, the Nigeria branch. And he identified certain risk factors that make diversion highly likely once legally procured weapons make their way to us.
You know, like if you are dealing with a state actor and non-state actor, there will be price differential. What you sell to, assuming $10 to state actor, you can sell $50 to non-state actors, because probably non-state actor may want to use it for illicit purpose. So it's more lucrative. And non-state actors could be a warlord, could be someone, militant groups. You understand? Somebody like, the recent guy that is tormenting Southwest, Sunday, Igbo, and that's a typical example of his non-state actors. Definitely, he will not go about empty-handed. He will need to be harmed, and people around him will be... It's another ballgame.
Basically, it comes down to money. And in Nigeria, we have our share of non-state actors and sectarian actors that would be willing to pay top naira for weapons. Boko Haram is obviously the one we focused on, but Others include bandits, warlords, cultists, militants, and other oppressors. Another risk factor that makes diversion likely is that we have weak stockpile management controls.
There's another critical area that must be looked into. You see, each and every security outfit, so to say, the army, the military, air force, police, civil defense, now, conventionally and statutorily, they should have armories. Armories is where they keep their arsenals, their guns and bullets. But those armories, one, some of them are not even with any armory, which is wrong. Those that have, they are not adhering to the SOPs, standard operating procedures. So we went around. I think it was the best one that we saw was immigration in Abuja here as a case study. Immigration, and even the immigration, like assuming this is a set of office, you are not to situate armory inside this building. Armory should be somewhere far because of ventilation, because of a possible explosion and all this. So some of them are not operating on that degree. So it gives room for arms to slip through the doors and find their way to. So it's one of the ways in which one can suggest that, okay, if we have standard armories, then proper records will be kept. Then you now know, yes, we have imported so number of ammunitions and guns and this, and after which they are not serviceable again, then there should be a public destruction and not burning, cutting. That's what the international instruments stipulate. Because if you burn, there are some guns that will still maintain its efficacy even after being burnt. So someone can go back again, dust it, and just polish it, and the thing start working again. But if it's cut in pieces, like you are cutting fish, to put it together may not be readily possible. Then aside from that,
the inability to manage our stockpile makes it possible for criminals to attack police stations and walk away with weapons. So, for example, we've seen these type of attacks increase since the EndSARS protest in October last year. Now, don't forget, another way for weapons to go from legal to illicit is if they get diverted from another destination. So, for example, Niger or Chad receive weapons, but those weapons then make their way across the border to Nigeria.
Border security, physical security, these are other aspects of ATT. And we have about 923,000 square kilometers. What is the strength of Nigeria Immigration Service? Can they even man half of that? Then the way we man borders give room for people to infiltrate us with anything they like. You understand? Maybe even on donkeys, people plying arms, especially in the northern part of the country. So it's one thing for...
This issue of border control has been on the top of minds for many security analysts. We hear the phrase porous borders over and over again in discussions about security. Nigeria's Niger border alone runs at over 1,600 kilometers in length. The Nigeria-Benin border runs at over 800 kilometers, and the Nigeria-Cameroon border is nearly 2,000 kilometers in length. This is over 4,000 kilometers together, and that entire length simply cannot be physically manned.
So, short of putting a person along every 10 kilometers or so along the border, we have to get a bit more creative about how we secure the borders. The United Nations Office of Counterterrorism has put together guidance to help countries improve border security and management. Top of the list of their recommendations is to improve interagency cooperation.
This means that the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Justice, all our state security services, police force, customs, all have to share information about emerging threats, and they also have to coordinate their actions. So, as we work to get our internal organizations talking to each other, we also need to establish cooperation with our neighboring countries. And it would help if they are also simultaneously working on their own interagency cooperation. The thing is, we can do everything right on our side, but if Niger, Benin, and Cameroon do not hold up their end, we won't get very far. And hopefully, the implementation of the African Free Trade Agreement will help provide incentive for our neighbors to speed up efforts around border security.
There's also empowering border communities to engage in community policing initiatives. A few weeks ago, we spoke to Alhaji Ibrahim Katsina, a retired director of internal security. He has been at the forefront to establish community policing programs in northern Nigeria. Yes, we can enhance border security by implementing technologies like drones and other electronic surveillance systems, but nothing beats human intelligence, especially when that human has incentive. A few episodes ago, we mentioned the idea of establishing universal basic income in mining towns. We may also want to consider this for border towns as well.
At the end of the day, and we said this last time, conflict is what drives the trade of illicit weapons. We need to re-establish conflict management practices. Yes, we had conflict management in the past, but we are in a different time now. There is more diversity in communities, and we need to give them the tools to manage small conflicts before they attract illicit weapons and turn into big wars that Nigeria simply cannot manage.
Hey everyone, we have a correction to make. We said that the US denied the sales of arms to the Jonathan administration, possibly under the Arms Trade Treaty. Further research shows that the US applied the Leahy Law. The Leahy Law prohibits the US government from using funds to assist units of foreign security forces if there is credible information that the unit has committed gross human rights violations. Okay, on to my closing comment. Things that flow follow a path of least resistance. When it comes to the flow of arms, the first layer of resistance is conflict resolution through education and economic opportunities. If that layer of resistance is weak, the next layer of resistance are laws which are enforced by an incorruptible security system. What we have in Nigeria are security forces, police, army, navy, air force, state security services, customs officers. What we need is a security system. A system is what connects the individual forces together so that they can work as one to achieve one mission. A poorly equipped but well-connected system can defeat a force that has the most advanced weapons in the world. And we've seen this happen over and over again in Vietnam and Afghanistan. In a system, connections exist to facilitate the meaningful flow of information. That's what actually allows each element to function in order to achieve the larger mission. A security system with the purpose to eliminate or limit the proliferation of small arms and light weapons needs information. Who, what, when, where, and how. Now today, answers to each of these sits with the different security forces. But if we integrate them, if we can connect them, we can solve the problem of small arms and light weapons proliferation. That's if we want to solve the problem. The Backstory is brought to you by E Media Productions. Production copyright 2021 E Media Productions. If you enjoyed this episode of The Backstory and want to hear more, subscribe to our 234 Audio YouTube channel. Episodes of this podcast can also be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of The Backstory was produced by Nabilah, Usman, Alexandra, Gekpe, Nico, Rivers, Dominic, Tabakaji, and Sam, Tabakaji. Special thanks to Olumayowa Olaneye, Machofi Singo, Fiede Olubenga, Rabia Hadejia, Richard Anyebe, Anthonieta Kalunta, John Iwodi, Stanley Bentu, Aredi Isha, and Malaiwa Gbado Ikaleku. I'm Rahmat Muhammad. See you next week.